The Harley-Davidson sat in Frank Delano's garage for 31 years. 31 years of Saturday mornings spent polishing the chrome, of slow Sunday rides through the Pennsylvania backroads, of summer evenings sitting on the workbench beside the bike with a cold beer in his hand, and the garage door open, and the warm air smelling of motor oil and freshly cut grass, and the particular quiet contentment of a man who has built a life he is satisfied with. The motorcycle was a 1979 Harley-Davidson FXS lowrider, black and chrome, two-tone fuel tank with the orange and white tank decals that were standard for that year, drag bars, a solo seat, forward controls. The bike had been beautiful when Frank bought it new in 1980, and it was still beautiful in 2011, after 31 years of careful ownership. The chrome was deep and clean. The paint was original. Frank had refused to repaint it, even when the lacquer began to develop the small spider cracks that come with age. He believed that a motorcycle's original paint was part of its history, and that to replace it was to erase a piece of the bike's life. Frank was 61 years old. He was a retired United States Marine. He had served 24 years on active duty, from 1968 to 1992, including 2 tours in Vietnam in his early years, and a final assignment as a master gunnery sergeant at Camp Lejeune before his retirement. He was a big man, 6'2", built thick through the shoulders and chest, with the particular solidity that career Marines carry into their later years, the way an oak tree carries its strength even after the leaves have started to thin. His hair was iron gray and cut short. His face was lined and weathered, with the deep crow's feet of a man who had spent a lot of time squinting into bright sun. His hands were huge and rough, the knuckles enlarged from years of physical work, the palms calloused from decades of holding rifles and tools, and the leather grips of his motorcycle. Frank lived in a small town in central Pennsylvania called Millerstown, population about 700. The kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, where the post office and the diner and the hardware store were all within a 2-block walk of each other, and where the most exciting thing that happened on most days was the arrival of the daily mail truck. Frank had moved to Millerstown after his retirement from the Marines, choosing the town because it was quiet and because it was close to a network of beautiful winding back roads that ran through the rolling hills and farmland of the Susquehanna River Valley. He lived alone. His wife, Margaret, had died in 2003 of breast cancer. They had been married for 28 years. The grief had nearly destroyed Frank in the first year after Margaret's death. He had stopped riding for almost 6 months, stopped going to the diner, stopped doing most of the things that made his life feel like a life. The Harley had sat in the garage during those months, untouched, gathering dust, while Frank sat in his living room and stared at the television and tried to figure out how to be alive without the woman he had loved. What pulled him back was his daughter. Frank and Margaret had one child, a daughter named Rachel, born in 1982. Rachel was 21 when her mother died. She was finishing her senior year at Penn State, studying nursing, planning to graduate the following spring and start her career in pediatric care. Rachel had been her mother's daughter in every way that mattered: kind, patient, fundamentally optimistic, with the same warm laugh and the same particular way of touching her father's arm when she wanted his attention. After Margaret's death, Rachel had taken on the role her mother could no longer fill. She had called Frank every day. She had driven home from state college every weekend, even during finals week, even during the brutal Pennsylvania winters when the drive took an extra hour because of the snow. She had pulled her father back into the world by sheer stubborn persistence, the way a person pulls a friend out of a deep hole, slowly, patiently, refusing to let go of the rope. By 2005, Frank was riding again, By 2007, he was eating meals regularly. By 2010, he had built something resembling a normal life, a daily routine, a small group of friends at the diner, the Harley in the garage, the Saturday morning rides through the Susquehanna Valley. He was not the man he had been before. Margaret died. He would never be that man again. But he was a man, and he was alive. And he was, on the good days, even something close to happy. Rachel had become a pediatric nurse. She worked at Hershey Medical Center about an hour east of Millerstown. She had married a good man, Daniel, a high school history teacher. In 2008, they lived in a small house in Hershey. They had been trying to have children for 2 years. In June of 2011, Rachel called her father with news. She was pregnant, 8 weeks along, due in February. A girl, the early ultrasound said, though Rachel and Daniel had decided not to find out the gender officially. They wanted to be surprised. Rachel had told Frank because she could not wait. She had to tell someone, and the person she most wanted to tell was her father. Frank had cried on the phone. He never cried. He had not cried since Margaret's funeral, but he cried that day in his kitchen, holding the receiver against his ear and listening to his daughter's happy voice, telling him that he was going to be a grandfather. He cried because he was happy, and because he wished Margaret could be here to share this moment, and because Rachel, his stubborn, beautiful Rachel, who had pulled him back from the edge after her mother died, was going to have a child of her own. The summer of 2011 was the best summer Frank had experienced since Margaret died. Rachel and Daniel came to Millerstown several times. Frank rode his Harley with new energy, with new purpose, planning the rides he would take with his future grandchild. First, the slow rides around the yard with the child on his lap, then the longer rides through the country roads. Then eventually the day when the grandchild would be old enough to learn to ride their own motorcycle, with Frank teaching them the way he had taught Rachel when she was 16. Frank made plans. He cleaned out the spare bedroom in his house and started thinking of it as the grandchild's room. He bought a small wooden cradle at a yard sale and refinished it himself, sanding it down and applying coat after coat of varnish until the wood glowed. He started saving money in a separate account for the grandchild's college fund. Then in October of 2011, when Rachel was 22 weeks pregnant, the call came that changed everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Frank was in his kitchen drinking his second cup of coffee, listening to the local AM radio station. The phone rang. He answered. It was Rachel. She was at the hospital. The doctors had found something on her routine ultrasound, something in the baby's heart, a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a rare congenital defect where the left side of the heart fails to develop properly. The doctors were saying that the baby would need surgery shortly after birth. Multiple surgeries. The first one within days of being born. Then a second surgery at about 6 months. Then a third at about 3 years. Rachel was crying. Not hysterical crying, quiet crying. The crying of a young woman who was a nurse, who knew exactly what hypoplastic left heart syndrome was, who knew exactly what the surgical statistics looked like, and who was trying to be brave for her baby and her husband and her father, all at the same time. Frank held the phone and listened to his daughter cry, and felt something in his chest crack and break and reform into something harder. He had heard this kind of news before, in Vietnam, in the Marines, the kind of news that arrives without warning and rearranges everything that was solid in your life into something completely different. He had developed over decades of military service a particular response to bad news, a response that was not denial and was not panic, but was something else, something more useful, calm, focus, the mental gathering of resources for the work that needed to be done. "Tell me what we need," Frank said. His voice was steady. "Tell me what to do. Daddy, I don't—" "Rachel, listen to me. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Whatever you need, we will figure out. But I need you to tell me what we are dealing with. The medical part, the financial part, all of it. I need to know." Rachel took a breath. She told him the medical part, the hospital where the surgeries would be performed. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one of the best in the country for pediatric cardiac care, but 2.5 hours from Hershey. The team of specialists who would be involved. The surgical timeline, the recovery time, the fact that Rachel would have to take a leave of absence from work for at least 6 months, possibly a year. The fact that Daniel's teaching job had limited paternity leave and that he would lose income during the months after the birth. The financial part was the part that Frank had been preparing himself for. He knew, even before Rachel said the numbers, that they were going to be enormous. American healthcare, American insurance, the strange, brutal mathematics of being sick in a country that treated medical care as a financial product. He braced himself. "Daddy," Rachel said. Her voice was small. "Our insurance covers a lot, but not everything. The deductibles alone are huge. The out-of-network specialists, the travel costs, the accommodations in Philadelphia for 3 weeks at a time, the lost income from both of us, our share of the surgeries, 3 surgeries, plus the medications, plus the follow-up care for years. Rachel, they're estimating our out-of-pocket costs just for the first year at about $120,000. The kitchen was very quiet. Frank stood in his kitchen and looked at the wall and held the phone and thought about $120,000. He thought about Rachel and Daniel. Rachel was a nurse. Daniel was a high school teacher. They were not poor. They made decent middle-class incomes. But they were not wealthy. They had a small house with a small mortgage. They had some savings, maybe $20,000, maybe $25,000, not $120,000. "Daddy," Rachel said, "are you there?" "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm scared." Frank closed his eyes. He pressed his big, rough hand against his forehead. "I know you are. It's okay to be scared. You're allowed to be scared. What are we gonna do?" Frank opened his eyes. He looked out his kitchen window. The window faced the side yard where his garage stood, a freestanding 2-bay garage that he had built himself in 1995 with his own hands. After he and Margaret had moved to Millerstown, the garage had been his project, his pride, the place where he kept his Harley and his tools and the accumulated equipment of 30 years of being a man who fixed things and built things and rode motorcycles. From the kitchen window, he could see the side door of the garage. The door was painted barn red. The door was the door he walked through hundreds of times a year. The door he opened on Saturday mornings to wheel out his motorcycle. The door that opened onto a space he loved more than any other space in the world, except for the bedroom he had shared with Margaret and the places where he had spent time with Rachel. "We're gonna figure it out," Frank said. "All of us. Together. I want you to come home this weekend. You and Daniel. We'll sit at the kitchen table and we'll go through everything. We'll make a plan. You're not going to do this alone. Do you hear me? Yes. Say it back to me. I'm not going to do this alone. That's right, you're not. I love you. I'll see you Saturday. I love you too, Daddy." Frank hung up the phone. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the garage through the window. The morning sun was hitting the red door. The day was beautiful. October in Pennsylvania, the leaves at their peak, yellow and orange and deep red. the rolling hills of the Susquehanna Valley turning into a fire of color that would last another 2 weeks before the rains came, and the leaves fell, and the long gray winter began. Frank walked to the garage. He opened the side door. He went inside. The garage smelled the way it always smelled, motor oil and metal and the faint sweetness of old wood. The Harley sat in its usual spot, on its kickstand, in the center of the bay. The chrome caught the light from the small window above the workbench. The black paint was deep and clean. Frank walked to the motorcycle. He stood beside it. He put his big hand on the leather seat. The leather was warm from the morning sun coming through the window, worn smooth by 31 years of his weight. The seat had been part of his body in a way. The seat had carried him through grief and joy and the long, slow years of becoming the man he was now. The seat had been the place he sat when he needed to think, and the place he sat when he needed to stop thinking. "I'm sorry, old friend," Frank said, out loud, to the motorcycle. The words were quiet in the empty garage, but they were real. He had to say them out loud because if he only thought them, he was not sure he would believe what he was about to do. "I'm sorry." He stood with his hand on the leather seat for a long time. The morning sun moved across the workbench. The garage was quiet, except for the faint, distant sound of a tractor working in a field a half-mile away. Frank stood beside his Harley and made the decision that he had already made, in his kitchen, when Rachel had told him $120,000. He was going to sell the motorcycle. Rachel and Daniel came to Millerstown that Saturday. Frank made breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast and coffee, the way Margaret used to make breakfast on Saturday mornings, the way Frank had learned to make it after she died. They ate at the kitchen table. They talked about ordinary things first, Daniel's teaching, Rachel's co-workers, the fall weather, the Penn State football team that was having another disappointing season. They did not talk about the medical news for the first half hour. They needed the half hour. They needed the small space of normality before they walked into the conversation that was waiting for them. Then Rachel set down her coffee cup. She looked at her father. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk." They moved to the living room. Frank had laid out a yellow legal pad and 3 pens on the coffee table. He had developed over 24 years in the Marines a particular method for facing problems that seemed too big to handle. The method was simple. Write everything down. Numbers, resources, obligations, options. Get every variable out of your head and onto paper, where you could see it, where you could measure it against the other variables, where you could begin to find solutions, instead of being overwhelmed by the size of the problem. They spent 2 hours at the coffee table. Frank wrote on the legal pad in his neat block letters. Rachel pulled up insurance documents on her laptop. Daniel had brought a folder of paperwork from the hospital. Estimates, breakdowns, the paperwork of pediatric cardiac care that they had received in the days since the diagnosis. The numbers were as bad as Rachel had said. Worse, actually. The insurance would cover a significant portion of the surgical costs themselves, but the deductibles, the out-of-pocket maximums, the specific specialists who were not in-network at CHEOP, the medications that required prior authorization, the travel and accommodation costs for the family during the surgical periods, the lost income from both Rachel and Daniel during the recovery months. When you added it all up, the realistic out-of-pocket cost for the first year of the baby's life was somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000. Rachel and Daniel had savings, about $23,000. They had a small home equity line of credit they could draw on, maybe another $15,000, without putting their house at serious risk. Daniel had a 401k at the school district, but withdrawing from it before retirement would carry penalties and would devastate their long-term financial security. Rachel had a small inheritance from her mother, $8,000 that had been earmarked for the future grandchild's education. When they put together everything they could realistically access without ruining themselves financially for the next 20 years, they came to about $46,000, which was not nothing. But it was not $120,000 either. The gap was about $75,000. Frank looked at the legal pad. He looked at Rachel. He looked at Daniel. "I have some money," Frank said. "Not as much as I'd like, but some." He had started saving aggressively after Margaret died. He had been a Marine, a master gunnery sergeant, for 24 years, which meant he had a decent military pension. He had also worked for 19 years in civilian life after the Marines as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Harrisburg, before retiring at 60. He had 2 pensions. He had Social Security. He had Medicare. His expenses were small. The house in Millerstown was paid off. The property taxes were low. His lifestyle was modest. He had been able to save about $38,000 over the past 8 years. "I can give you the 38, Frank said. "All of it." "That gets us to about 84,000. Rachel started crying. "Daddy, no. That's your savings. That's your retirement." "Rachel, I have my pensions. I have my Social Security. I have this house, paid off. I'm not going to need that money. You and the baby are going to need that money." "Frank," Daniel said, quietly, "we can't take all your savings. We can't." "You can and you will. I have made up my mind. The question now is the gap. 84,000 from us. Need 120. 40,000 short. That's the question." They sat in silence for a few moments. The legal pad lay between them. The number 40,000 sat on the paper in Frank's neat block letters. Frank already knew the answer. He had known the answer since Tuesday morning, since the moment he had stood in his garage and put his hand on his Harley's leather seat and apologized to the motorcycle. But he wanted Rachel and Daniel to be in the conversation. He wanted them to be part of the decision. He did not want to simply announce what he was going to do. "There's the motorcycle," Frank said. Rachel looked up. Her eyes widened. She started shaking her head before he had even finished the sentence. "No, Daddy, no." "Rachel, no, Daddy, not the motorcycle, not your Harley. It's a motorcycle, it's a thing. It's not a thing, Daddy. You know it's not a thing. That motorcycle is. It's part of you. You've had that bike since before I was born. You ride it every Saturday. You taught me to ride on it. Mom said the motorcycle was your therapy. She said you needed it. She said the motorcycle was how you stayed, Frank." Frank looked at his daughter. He looked at the woman who had pulled him out of his grief after her mother died. He looked at the daughter who knew him better than anyone alive, who had watched him work on his bike on Saturday mornings, who had ridden behind him on the bike when she was a teenager with her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek pressed against his back, who knew exactly what the motorcycle meant. "Rachel," Frank said, "listen to me. I love that motorcycle. You know I love it. Your mother knew I loved it. The motorcycle has been a good friend to me for 31 years, but I am 61 years old. I will not be riding forever. The motorcycle is going to outlive my ability to ride it eventually. And what is the point of having a motorcycle in the garage when my granddaughter, your daughter, needs surgery to live? Daddy, there is no point. There is no question. The motorcycle is a piece of metal and chrome and rubber. The baby is family. You don't even have to think about that calculation. Family wins. Every time. Forever." Rachel was crying. Daniel was sitting beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet. He looked at Frank. "Frank," Daniel said, "are you sure?" "I'm sure." "How much do you think the bike is worth?" Frank had researched this already. He had spent Wednesday evening on his computer, on motorcycle classifieds and vintage bike auction sites, looking at prices for 1979 FXS lowriders in good condition. He had been surprised by the numbers. The bike had appreciated significantly over the years. Vintage Harleys from the late 1970s and early 1980s had become collectible, particularly in original condition, particularly examples that had been well maintained. "Probably around 28,000, Frank said. Maybe a little more. The matching numbers and the original paint help. The mileage is low, only 34,000 miles on it after 31 years. Rachel did the math. She looked at the legal pad. 84,000 from the family, 28,000 from the motorcycle, 112,000. Still a few thousand short of the highest estimate, but enough, more than enough, to cover the most realistic scenario with some buffer for unexpected expenses. That covers it, Daniel said, quietly. Frank, that covers it. Then that's what we do, Frank said. Rachel stood up. She walked around the coffee table. She sat down on her father's lap, the way she had sat on his lap when she was a little girl, the way she had sat on his lap on the day of her mother's funeral, the way she had sat on his lap on her wedding day before, walking down the aisle. She was 29 years old and pregnant, and she was sitting on her father's lap and crying into the shoulder of his flannel shirt. "I love you, Daddy," she said. "I love you too, sweetheart. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because I want to. There is nothing in this world I want more than to make sure my granddaughter has every chance she can have. There is nothing. The motorcycle is it's just a way of getting there. It's a means. The baby is the end." Rachel cried for a while. Frank held her. Daniel sat beside them, his hand on Rachel's back. The autumn sun came through the living room windows and fell on the three of them, and on the legal pad with the numbers, and on the small house that had become, in this moment, the place where a family decided that they were going to face the impossible thing together. After a while, Rachel sat up. She wiped her face. She looked at her father. "Promise me one thing," she said. "What?" "Promise me that someday, when this is all over, when the baby is healthy, when we're past this, promise me you'll get another motorcycle. I don't want you to be without one forever. Mom would want you to have one. I want you to have one. Promise me." Frank looked at her. He thought about it. He thought about being 61 years old, about how long it would take him to save another $28,000 on a fixed income, about whether he would even be physically able to ride by the time he had saved that much. Saving $28,000 on his pensions while paying for his own ordinary expenses would take 10 years, maybe more. He would be 71 or older. His knees were already not what they used to be. His back was already starting to complain about long rides. By the time he could afford another motorcycle, he probably would not be able to ride it. But Rachel was looking at him with her mother's eyes, Margaret's eyes, the eyes that always saw straight through him. "I promise," Frank said. He did not know if he was lying to her. He did not think so. But he knew even as he said the words that the promise might be a kind of lie, even if he did not intend it to be. The promise was a thing he wanted to be true, rather than a thing he could guarantee. But Rachel needed the promise, and Frank needed to give it to her, and so he gave it to her, and she accepted it, and they moved on to the next thing. The next thing was the practical work. Frank would call a few motorcycle dealers and a few collectors he knew through the rider community. He would get the bike sold within the next 3 weeks. He would transfer the proceeds to Rachel's account. Rachel and Daniel would handle the medical scheduling, the insurance paperwork, the logistical preparation for the surgery that would happen within hours of the baby's birth in February. Rachel and Daniel left in the late afternoon. Frank stood on his front porch and watched their car drive down the street and turn the corner and disappear. Then, he went back into the house. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the legal pad with the numbers. He sat alone in the autumn evening and let himself feel, for the first time since Tuesday morning, what he had not allowed himself to feel. He felt sad, not depressed, not despairing, just sad. The clean, honest sadness of a man who had loved a thing for 31 years and who was about to let it go for a reason he believed in completely. The sadness was real. The sadness was permitted. But the sadness was not the most important thing. The most important thing was Rachel and the baby. The motorcycle was the means. The baby was the end. Frank had said it that afternoon, and he believed it that evening, and he would believe it for the rest of his life. He cried a little, sitting at the kitchen table. He let the tears come. He had not cried since the phone call from Rachel on Tuesday. It was time. He cried for Margaret, who would have known what to say to him right now. He cried for Rachel, who was facing something that no parent should have to face. He cried for the baby, who would be born into a world of hospitals and surgeries and uncertainty. And he cried, a little, for his motorcycle, for the Saturday mornings that were ending, for the Sunday rides that would not happen anymore, for the weight of the bike under him and the sound of the engine and the feeling of moving through the Pennsylvania backroads with the wind in his face and the world stretching out ahead. He cried for about 10 minutes. Then he stopped. He wiped his face. He stood up. He made himself a sandwich. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter. He drank a glass of water. He went to the garage. The Harley sat where it always sat. Frank turned on the overhead lights. He walked around the bike. He looked at it from every angle, the way a person looks at someone they are about to say goodbye to. He memorized the details, the chrome, the paint, the leather seat, the drag bars, the way the orange and white tank decals had faded slightly on the right side, where the morning sun came through the small window above the workbench every day for 31 years. He picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts. He found a number for a man he had known for about 15 years, a Harley collector named Ray Whitlock, who lived outside of Lancaster and who had told Frank several times over the years that if Frank ever decided to sell the FXS, Ray would be interested. Frank pressed the call button. The phone rang. Ray answered on the third ring. "Frank, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" Frank stood in his garage, his hand on the leather seat of his Harley, and looked at the motorcycle while he spoke. "Ray, I need to sell the bike." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Ray's voice came back, quieter now, more serious. "What's wrong, Frank?" "My granddaughter. She's going to need surgery. Heart condition, big bills. I need the money." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Frank." "Yeah, me too. Are you sure? You've had that bike since I've known you." "I'm sure. I need to sell it. Are you still interested?" "Of course I'm interested. I've wanted that bike for 15 years. But, Frank, listen. Let me come up there and look at it this weekend. Let's make this fair. I don't want to take advantage of you in a hard time. You're not taking advantage. The bike's worth what it's worth. I checked the prices. About $28,000 for a clean one. Yours if you want it. I want it. I'll be there Saturday. $28,000 cash. No haggling. Frank closed his eyes. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the workbench beside him. "Thank you, Ray. Don't thank me. I'm getting a hell of a motorcycle. You're the one doing the hard thing. I'll see you Saturday." Frank hung up. He stood in the garage for a long time, his hand on the leather seat, his eyes on the chrome, his mind already preparing for the goodbye that was going to happen on Saturday morning when Ray Whitlock arrived with $28,000 in cash and drove away with Frank's motorcycle in the back of his pickup truck. He turned off the overhead lights. He walked to the side door. He stopped. He looked back at the bike one more time, sitting in the dim light of the garage, the chrome catching the last of the evening light from the window above the workbench. "I'm sorry, old friend," Frank said again. The same words he had said on Tuesday, the same apology. He needed to keep saying it. He needed to make sure the motorcycle understood, though he knew the motorcycle was a machine and could not understand anything. That this was not abandonment. This was love. This was the deepest love Frank had, the love of family, the love that overrode everything else. He closed the side door. He walked back to the house. He went to bed early. He didn't sleep well. The phone calls started on Thursday morning. Frank was at the diner, Millie's Diner, the small breakfast spot on Main Street where Frank had been eating breakfast almost every weekday morning for the last 15 years. Millie's was the kind of place where the same dozen regulars showed up at the same times every day, sat at the same stools or in the same booths, ordered the same things. The diner was the social center of Millerstown for the men in their 60s and 70s who had retired or semi-retired, and it was where Frank had built his small post-Margaret community. The other regulars were a specific group. Henry Babcock, a retired farmer in his late 60s. Walter Nesbitt, a retired truck driver, 65. Jimmy Fortenberry, a former fire chief, 72. Big Tom McKenna, a Vietnam veteran like Frank, also a retired Marine, 63. Dale Conrad, a 68-year-old man who had run the local hardware store for 40 years before selling it and retiring. And Earl Pritchard, the 74-year-old former mechanic who still wore his coveralls every morning out of pure habit. These 6 men, plus Frank, made up the core of the Millie's morning crowd. They had been having breakfast together, more or less, for the past decade. They knew everything about each other. They knew about each other's families, their children, their grandchildren, their health problems, their political opinions, their preferences in coffee and eggs and bacon. They were not best friends in the dramatic sense. They did not call each other on weekends to chat. They did not go on vacations together. They did not text or send Christmas cards. But they were something perhaps more important than best friends. They were a community. They were a steady, reliable group of men who showed up for each other every morning, who noticed when one of them was missing, who asked about each other's lives and listened to the answers. On Thursday morning, Frank told them, he had not planned to. He had walked into the diner with the intention of just having his usual breakfast and going home. But as the morning went on, as the conversation moved through its usual rhythms, the weather, the football game, Henry's tractor that needed a new transmission, Walter's son who was moving back to Pennsylvania from Texas, Frank felt himself wanting to say it, needing to say it. The other men would know if he didn't. They would know something was wrong and they would ask, the way they always asked. And he would either have to lie or tell them. "I'm selling the Harley," Frank said. The words came out flat, matter of fact, the way a man delivers news he does not want to deliver. The conversation at the table stopped. The other 6 men looked at him. 6 pairs of weathered eyes, all of them old enough to know that a man does not sell his 31-year-old motorcycle without a serious reason. "Why?" Big Tom asked. So Frank told them. He told them about Rachel and the baby and the diagnosis. He told them about the surgery and the costs. He told them about the family meeting on Saturday and the math on the legal pad and the gap between what they had and what they needed. He told them about Ray Whitlock coming on Saturday morning to pick up the bike for $28,000. The 6 men listened. None of them interrupted. None of them tried to give advice. They did the thing that good men in a small-town diner do when one of their own is going through something. They listened, and they nodded at the right moments, and they did not try to fix it because they understood that some things cannot be fixed by words. When Frank was finished, the table was quiet for a long moment. Then Earl Pritchard, the old mechanic who almost never spoke. "Your daughter," Earl said. "She's the one with the long brown hair. Worked at the hospital in Hershey. Came to your 60th birthday party at the church hall. That's her." Earl nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the other men. He did not say anything else. But something passed around the table. Frank saw it. 6 men looking at each other. 6 pairs of eyes meeting across the table and across the booth, communicating without words, the way men who have known each other for a long time communicate. Something was decided in those looks. Frank did not know what exactly, but something. "You drinking your coffee or what, Frank?" Big Tom said. The conversation moved on. The men talked about other things. Henry's tractor, Walter's son moving back, the weather forecast for the weekend. But Frank noticed throughout the rest of breakfast that the other men kept looking at each other in that particular way, the way men look at each other when they are planning something. He did not think much of it. He paid his check. He said goodbye. He walked home through the cool October morning. He had 2 more days before Ray Whitlock arrived on Saturday with the cash in the trailer. He spent Thursday afternoon and Friday in his garage, cleaning the bike, polishing the chrome, making sure every detail of the Harley was perfect for its new owner. He worked slowly, methodically, with the particular attention of a man who is taking care of a friend one last time. The work was therapy. The work let him say goodbye in a way that was active, that was useful, that gave his hands something to do while his heart adjusted to the absence that was coming. On Friday evening, after dinner, Frank's phone rang. He answered. It was Big Tom. "Frank, listen, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "What time is Ray Whitlock supposed to come tomorrow?" 10 o'clock. Why?" There was a pause on the line. "No reason. Just asking. The boys and I were thinking we'd come by your place around 9:30. Have one last cup of coffee with you and the bike. Send her off properly. That all right with you?" Frank smiled, the first real smile he had smiled in 3 days. The boys. 6 old men in a small Pennsylvania town, deciding to come over to send a motorcycle off properly. There was something deeply right about that. Something that captured, in a small way, exactly what was good about Millerstown and exactly why Frank had chosen to live there. "Of course it's all right," Frank said. "I'd like that." "Good. We'll see you at 9:30. Don't make coffee. We're bringing it. Tom, see you tomorrow, Frank." The line went dead. Frank stood in his kitchen holding the phone and feeling, for the first time since Tuesday, something that was not sadness or determination or grim acceptance, something warmer. The feeling of being part of something, the feeling of being in a community of men who were going to show up for him on a Saturday morning in October to send his motorcycle off properly. He did not know yet what they had planned. He did not yet understand that the simple gesture of bringing coffee was just the surface of something much larger. He went to bed that Friday night thinking that he was going to have one last quiet morning with his bike and his friends. And then Ray Whitlock was going to arrive at 10, and the bike would be loaded onto a trailer and driven away. That was not what was going to happen. Frank woke up at 5:30 on Saturday morning. He always woke up early. 24 years in the Marines had wired his body to rise before the sun, and 24 years out of the Marines had not been enough to rewire it. He lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the silence of the house, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside his window, listening to the particular quality of an early Saturday morning in autumn, when the world is still asleep and the day is waiting to begin. He got up. He showered. He shaved. He dressed in his usual Saturday clothes: jeans, a long-sleeve flannel shirt, his old leather work boots, the leather jacket that he had worn on the Harley for the last 15 years. The jacket was worn smooth at the elbows, and the cuffs were frayed at the edges. He had bought it at a leather shop in Reading in 1996. The jacket smelled like motor oil and old leather, and the faint sweetness of the wax he used to maintain it. He didn't need to wear the jacket today. He was not going to ride. But he wore it anyway, because today was the last day the bike would be his. And it felt right to be dressed for one more ride, even if the ride was not going to happen. He made coffee. He ate a piece of toast standing at the kitchen counter. He looked out the window at the garage. The morning was cold. The temperature had dropped into the upper 30s overnight, and a thin layer of frost glittered on the grass and the roof of the garage. The sky was clear. The eastern horizon was beginning to pink. The sun would be up in about 20 minutes. At 7 o'clock, Frank walked out to the garage. He turned on the overhead lights. He stood beside the Harley for a long time, just looking at it. The bike was perfect. He had spent 2 days cleaning every inch of it. The chrome was deep. The paint was clean. The leather was conditioned. The white wall accents on the tires gleamed. The bike looked the way it had looked on the day Frank had brought it home from the dealer in 1980. New, beautiful, ready. He spent the next 2 hours doing small things. He checked the oil. He topped up the brake fluid. He cleaned the spark plug terminals. He wiped down the exhaust pipes one last time. He was making the bike ready for its new owner, but he was also doing something else. He was saying goodbye in the only way he knew how, through his hands, through the small, careful tasks of mechanical maintenance, through the language of motorcycle care that he had been speaking with this particular machine for 31 years. At 9:15, Frank heard the first vehicle pull up outside. He walked to the side door of the garage. He looked out. A pickup truck was parked at the curb. Big Tom McKenna was getting out of the driver's seat. Tom waved. Frank waved back. Tom started walking up the driveway carrying a large insulated coffee carrier, the kind that holds a gallon of coffee at hot temperatures. Then another truck pulled up. Henry Babcock. Henry got out carrying a paper bag and another coffee carrier. Then a third truck. Walter Nesbitt. He had 2 paper bags this time. Frank stood in the side doorway of the garage and watched the trucks arriving. By 9:20, all 6 of the diner regulars were there. Big Tom, Henry, Walter, Jimmy Fortenberry, Dale Conrad, and Earl Pritchard. They were standing in his driveway in a cluster, holding coffee carriers and paper bags, all of them dressed the way they always dressed. Work jackets, jeans, ball caps. They looked like they did at the diner every weekday morning, except they were standing in Frank's driveway instead of sitting in their usual booth. Frank walked out to meet them. "You boys made enough coffee for an army," he said. "Marines drink a lot of coffee," Big Tom said. "Figured you might need extra today." The men came into the garage. They set the coffee and the bags on the workbench. The bags contained pastries. Henry's wife had made a coffee cake. Walter had stopped at a bakery in Newport. Jimmy had brought a box of donuts. There was enough food for a small wedding. Frank looked at the spread on the workbench and didn't know what to say. "Sit down, Frank," Earl said. The old mechanic was the one who said it. He pointed to the Harley's leather seat. "Sit on your bike. Drink your coffee. We're just here to send her off." Frank sat on the Harley. He had not sat on it since Wednesday. He had been keeping his distance the past few days, trying to make the separation easier. But sitting on the bike now, with the leather warm under him and the handlebars in front of him, and the familiar weight of the machine balanced beneath his thighs, the separation was made suddenly harder. The bike fit him. The bike had always fit him. 31 years of sitting in this exact position had shaped both Frank and the motorcycle to each other's contours. Big Tom poured Frank a cup of coffee. Frank took it. The other men poured their own cups. They stood around the garage, leaning against the workbench, sitting on the small bench Frank kept against the back wall, standing with their cups in their hands. The garage was warm with 7 men breathing, and 7 cups of hot coffee and the comfortable mass of 7 bodies in a small space. "To Frank's Harley," Henry said, raising his cup. 31 years of Saturday mornings. "To the Harley," the other men said. They all raised their cups. They all drank. "Tell us about her," Walter said. "We've all seen her over the years, but I don't think we've ever heard the whole story." So Frank told them. Sitting on the motorcycle with his coffee in his hand, with 6 old friends listening, Frank told them about the Harley. He told them about the day he bought it in 1980 at a dealer in Allentown, when he was 30 years old and Margaret was 28 and they had just moved into their first house. He told them about the long rides he had taken with Margaret on the back of the bike, to the Poconos, to the Jersey Shore, to a small inn in upstate New York where they had spent their 5th anniversary. He told them about teaching Rachel to ride when she was 16 in the empty parking lot of the church, with Rachel terrified and laughing at the same time. He told them about the years after Margaret died, the 6 months when the bike sat in the garage and Frank could not bring himself to look at it, the Saturday morning in May 2004 when he had finally walked out to the garage, started the engine and ridden, slowly, badly with tears running down his face, to the end of his street and back. The way the motorcycle had pulled him back to life, slowly, week by week, ride by ride, until he was once again a man who got up on Saturdays and put on his leather jacket and went out into the world. He told them about his favorite ride, a loop he had developed over the decades, north out of Millerstown through the small towns of Liverpool and Mifflintown and Lewistown, then west along Route 322 through the Tuscarora State Forest, then south on Route 75 back through the rolling farmland to home, about 140 miles. He had ridden the loop probably 400 times over 31 years. He could ride it in his sleep. He knew every curve, every stop sign, every place where deer crossed the road in the early morning. The loop was his church. The loop was where he had done his deepest thinking and his hardest grieving and his most patient working through of the questions that life had put in front of him. The other men listened. They drank their coffee. They did not interrupt. Earl Pritchard, the old mechanic, kept his eyes on the bike the whole time Frank was talking, looking at it the way mechanics look at machines they admire, with attention, with respect, with the particular love that mechanics develop for objects that have been well cared for over a long period of time. Frank finished his story. The garage was quiet for a moment. "That's a hell of a motorcycle," Big Tom said. "It is," Frank said. The men were quiet again. Frank looked at his watch. 9:50. 10 minutes until Ray Whitlock arrived. "Boys," Frank said, "I appreciate you coming. More than I can say. But Ray's gonna be here in about 10 minutes, and I should probably—" "Frank," Big Tom said, "listen, there's something we need to tell you." The other men shifted slightly. Frank felt the same thing he had felt on Thursday morning at the diner. The silent communication between the 6 men. The looks that meant a plan had been made. He looked at Big Tom. Big Tom looked uncomfortable. Or not uncomfortable. Determined. The look of a man who was about to do something that he had been preparing himself to do. "What is it, Tom?" Big Tom looked at the other men. Earl Pritchard nodded slightly. Henry Babcock cleared his throat. Walter pulled a folded envelope out of the inside pocket of his jacket. "Frank," Big Tom said, "we've been talking, the boys and me, since Thursday morning." "All right." "We made some calls, did some thinking, did some collecting." Frank felt something move in his chest, something he could not yet identify, a premonition, a small wave of awareness that the morning was about to become something different than what he had been expecting. "What did you do?" Frank asked. Walter handed Big Tom the envelope. Big Tom looked at it for a moment. Then he handed it to Frank. "Open it," Big Tom said. Frank took the envelope. It was heavy. Heavier than an envelope should be. He opened it. Inside was a check. A bank check made out to Frank Delano, drawn on the First National Bank of Millerstown. The amount of the check was $47,000. Frank stared at the check. He did not understand what he was looking at. The number was wrong. The number could not be right. He looked up at Big Tom. "What is this?" "It's what we raised, Frank." What do you mean?" Big Tom sat down on the workbench. The other men were watching him. Earl was watching the floor. Henry was watching the bike. Walter was watching Frank. Jimmy and Dale were watching each other. Big Tom took a breath. "After breakfast on Thursday," Big Tom said, "we stayed at the diner after you left. The 6 of us. We sat there for another hour, drinking coffee, not saying much. Then Earl said something. He said, we need to do something about this. We can't just let Frank sell his Harley. Not this Harley. Not for this reason." Big Tom looked at Earl. Earl was still looking at the floor. Earl did not like being looked at. "So we started thinking," Big Tom continued. 6 old men in Millerstown, what could we do? None of us has $40,000 in our checking account. None of us is rich. But we have time. We have phones. We know people. We've all lived in this area for 40, 50, 70 years. We know everyone." Big Tom paused. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at Frank. "So we made some calls. Each of us. We started Thursday afternoon. We called everyone we could think of. Family, friends, old co-workers, people at the church, people at the VA, people at the American Legion, people at the diner who weren't there Thursday morning but who would have been there if their schedules had been different. We told them what was happening with you and your daughter and your granddaughter. We didn't ask for a specific amount. We just told them the story. Frank Delano, Marine, 24 years of service. His granddaughter needs heart surgery. He's selling his motorcycle to pay for it. We thought maybe people would want to chip in, even a little bit." Frank was holding the check in his hand. He was looking at the number. $47,000. The number was not making sense to him. The number was too big. By Friday morning, Big Tom said, we had raised about $8,000. Word started spreading on its own. People who got the call from one of us called other people. People at the church mentioned it to their friends. the story got into the next town. People we didn't know started reaching out, asking how to contribute. By Friday afternoon, we were at 20,000. By Friday night, we were at 35. By this morning, when we picked up the bank check before we came over, we were at 47,000 and rising. There are still people calling. There are still checks coming in. But we wanted to give you what we had this morning. Before Ray Whitlock got here, Frank could not speak. He sat on his motorcycle in his garage and held a check for $47,000 and looked at 6 old men who had stood beside him at the diner counter every morning for 10 years, and who had, in 3 days, gone door to door and phone call by phone call through the towns of central Pennsylvania to raise enough money to keep him from having to sell his motorcycle. "Frank," Big Tom said, "listen, we're not telling you what to do. The check is yours. You can use it however you need to use it. If you still need to sell the bike to make up the rest, that's your call. But the boys and me, we wanted you to know. People care about you. A lot of people. People you know and people you don't even know. We told them about the Marine who's selling his Harley to pay for his granddaughter's heart surgery, and they reached into their wallets and they gave what they could. $20, $50, $500. One man, guy in Liverpool. Earl knows him. He used to run the feed store. He gave $5,000. He just wrote a check. He said his own granddaughter had heart surgery 10 years ago, and he knew what it cost, and he wanted to help. People want to help, Frank. They just need someone to ask." Frank's hand was shaking. The check was shaking with it. He was looking at the number and he was trying to understand what had happened to him in the last 3 minutes. He had walked into this garage this morning, expecting to say goodbye to his motorcycle. He was now sitting on his motorcycle holding a check for $47,000 and looking at 6 men who had refused to let him say goodbye. "Aye," Frank said. The word came out small. He cleared his throat. He tried again. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Frank. This is too much." "It's not too much. It's just enough. With your savings, plus what Rachel and Daniel can put in. Plus this, you don't need to sell the bike. The math works without selling the bike." Frank looked at the check again. He did the math in his head. 84,000 from the family. 47,000 from the diner boys and the people they had called. 131,000. More than enough to cover the highest estimate, with buffer. He didn't need to sell the motorcycle. The sentence sat in his head and would not move. He did not need to sell the motorcycle. The motorcycle that he had been preparing himself to sell for 3 days. The motorcycle whose chrome he had been polishing and whose oil he had been topping up and whose seat he had been sitting on for one last morning. The motorcycle he had been saying goodbye to since Tuesday afternoon. The motorcycle that was supposed to leave his life in 15 minutes. He did not need to sell it. Frank put his face in his hands. He was still sitting on the bike. He pressed his big, rough palms against his eyes. His shoulders started shaking. He was crying. He had not cried in front of another person except Rachel since Margaret's funeral. He had not cried in front of these men ever. He was a Marine. Marines did not cry in garages in front of other Marines and old farmers and former fire chiefs and retired truck drivers and old hardware store owners and old mechanics who never spoke. But Frank was crying. Hard. The sobs were coming up from deep in his chest, from a place he had been keeping locked since Tuesday morning when Rachel had called him and told him about the baby's heart. He was crying for his granddaughter. He was crying for his daughter. He was crying for his motorcycle, which he was not going to lose. He was crying for Margaret. who was not here to see this. He was crying for himself, 61 years old, sitting on his Harley in his garage on a Saturday morning, surrounded by men who loved him enough to spend 3 days raising $47,000 so that he would not have to give up the thing that mattered to him most, besides his family. The other men did not say anything. They let him cry. Big Tom, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam himself and who knew about Marines and crying, simply stood beside the workbench with his arms crossed and his eyes wet, and waited. Earl Pritchard, the mechanic, who hadn't said more than 10 words at any one time in the last decade, stood by the bike and put his hand on the fuel tank, the way a man puts his hand on the shoulder of a friend who is grieving. Walter and Henry and Jimmy and Dale stood in their cluster and let Frank cry the way he needed to cry. Frank cried for about 3 minutes. Then he stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at the men. He looked at the check. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at the men again. "Boys," Frank said. His voice was rough. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Big Tom said. "Just drink your coffee. Eat a donut. Ray's gonna be here in 5 minutes and you've got a phone call to make." Frank laughed. He actually laughed. The sound surprised him. He had not expected to laugh. But he laughed, and the laugh broke something open inside him, and the morning suddenly felt different. Not sad, but full. Not heavy, but light. Not an ending, but a beginning. The morning felt like the kind of morning that he was going to remember for the rest of his life. He pulled out his phone. He called Ray Whitlock. Ray answered on the second ring. "Frank, I'm about 10 minutes out." "Ray, listen. Something happened. I'm sorry to do this to you on the day of, but I'm not selling the bike." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What happened, Frank?" Frank looked at the 6 men in his garage. He looked at the check in his hand. "My friends happened, Ray. My friends happened to me." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came back, warm and full. "Frank, I can't say I'm not disappointed about the bike, but I have to tell you, this is the best news I've heard all week. You keep that motorcycle. You hear me? You keep it. And you tell your friends, whoever they are, that they're good people." "I will, Ray. You take care of yourself. Tell your daughter and granddaughter we're praying for them." "Thank you, Ray." Frank hung up. He put the phone down on the workbench. He looked at the 6 men. "Well," he said, "I guess I'm not selling the bike." The men cheered, quietly, the way old men cheer, with raised coffee cups, with smiles, with a kind of contained pleasure that does not need to be loud to be real. Big Tom raised his cup. The other men raised theirs. Frank raised his. "To Frank's Harley," Big Tom said. 31 years and counting. "To the Harley," the other men said. They drank. Outside, the autumn sun was now high enough to be coming through the small window above the workbench, falling across the garage floor in a warm, bright rectangle that reached the front wheel of the motorcycle. The chrome caught the light and threw it back. The black paint glowed. The motorcycle, which was supposed to be leaving in 15 minutes, was staying. Frank looked at the bike. He looked at his hands. He looked at the check. He looked at the men. "I don't deserve this," Frank said. "You don't get to decide that, Frank," Earl Pritchard said. The old mechanic, speaking up for the second time in a week. "We get to decide that, and we decided you do." The other men nodded. Frank could not argue with them. He had been outvoted by 6 old men in a garage in Millerstown on a Saturday morning in October. He had been outvoted on the question of his own worthiness. He was not going to argue. The men stayed in the garage for another hour. They drank coffee. They ate the pastries. They told stories. The garage was full of the warm, comfortable sound of 7 men who had been through a lot of life together and who were now on this October Saturday morning sharing one of those rare moments when something good was actually happening. Something good that they had built together with their own hands and their own phone calls and their own unwillingness to let one of their own face a hard thing alone. Earl Pritchard told a story about his grandson, who was 20 and just starting trade school in Lancaster. Walter talked about his son moving back from Texas. Henry described in detail the transmission he was trying to rebuild on his old tractor. Big Tom told a Vietnam story, not a war story, but a story about a Marine who had taught Tom to play the harmonica during a long night in the mess tent in Da Nang. The story was sad and funny at the same time, the way Tom's stories always were. Frank sat on his motorcycle and listened. He drank his coffee. He laughed when the others laughed, but mostly he just sat and watched and let the morning happen around him. He was still processing. The check was still in his hand. The number on the check still seemed too large to be real. The fact that he had walked into the garage that morning expecting to lose his motorcycle and was now sitting on the motorcycle with a check that meant he would not lose it, that fact was sitting in him like a meal that was too big to digest all at once. At about 10:30, the men started getting ready to leave. Big Tom said he had to drive his wife to a doctor's appointment in Harrisburg. Henry said he had a tractor part being delivered at noon. Walter and Jimmy said they were going to swing by the diner. Millie's was open until 2 on Saturdays, and the boys liked to have a second cup of coffee there in the late morning before going home for the afternoon. Dale and Earl said they would walk back together. They lived on the same street, 3 blocks from Frank's house. The men gathered their coffee carriers and the empty paper bags. They moved toward the side door of the garage. Frank stood up from the motorcycle. He walked over to them. He shook each of their hands. He hugged Big Tom, the only hug he had given another man since Margaret's funeral. Tom hugged him back, hard, with the strength of a Marine who knew exactly what kind of hug was needed. "Frank," Big Tom said quietly when they separated, "there's one more thing." "What's that?" "There are still checks coming in. People are still calling. The 47,000 was just what we had as of this morning. We're going to keep collecting until the surgery. There's going to be more." Frank looked at him. "Tom, that's enough. That's more than enough. We have the math covered now. I don't need..." "Frank, listen, the medical part is covered, yes. But there's going to be expenses you haven't thought of yet. The travel, the hotel rooms in Philadelphia for 3 weeks at a time. Rachel taking unpaid leave. Daniel's lost income. Specialty foods if the baby has feeding issues after surgery. Equipment. Therapy. Things that are going to come up that none of us can predict. Whatever extra money comes in, you give it to your daughter. Tell her it's for whatever she needs. Don't argue with us about it. We're not asking. We're telling." Frank looked at Tom. He looked at the other man. He nodded slowly. He understood. He was being told. He was not being asked. The Millerstown community had decided that they were going to take care of Frank's family, and they were not interested in his opinion on the matter. "All right," Frank said. "All right." The men walked out of the garage. Frank stood in the side doorway and watched them get into their trucks and walk down the street. He waved at each of them. They waved back. The trucks pulled away one by one. Walter and Jimmy drove toward Millie's. Henry drove toward his farm. Big Tom drove toward Harrisburg. Dale and Earl walked down the street together, 2 old men in their work jackets, their hands in their pockets, talking about whatever old men talk about on a Saturday morning when they have just helped a friend keep his motorcycle. Frank watched them go. He stood in the doorway until the last truck was gone. and Dale and Earl had turned the corner at the end of the block. Then he closed the side door of the garage. He walked back to the bike. He sat down on the leather seat. He took out his phone. He called Rachel. She answered on the second ring. "Daddy." "Sweetheart, are you home?" "Yes." "Daniel's making breakfast." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Are you sitting down?" There was a pause on the other end. "Daddy, you're scaring me." "What is it?" "Sit down, Rachel, please." He heard her moving. He heard her telling Daniel that her father wanted her to sit down. He heard the small sounds of a chair being pulled out and Rachel sitting in it. "Okay, I'm sitting down. What's going on?" "I'm not selling the motorcycle." There was a long silence. "What?" "I'm not selling the motorcycle, Rachel." "Daddy, what happened? Did Ray fall through? Do you need help finding another buyer?" "I can..." "Rachel, listen. Stop talking. Listen to me." She stopped. "Tom McKenna and the boys at the diner," Frank said. "The guys I have breakfast with every morning. They found out about the bike, about why I was selling it. Tuesday I told you about the diagnosis. Thursday morning at breakfast I told them. They didn't say anything to me on Thursday, but after I left they decided to do something. They started calling people, everyone they knew. Family, friends, church, the VFW, the Legion, everyone. They told them about you and the baby. They asked them to chip in if they could." He paused. He looked at the check in his hand. "They raised $47,000, Rachel." The silence on the other end was complete. Frank could hear very faintly his daughter's breathing. 47,000. They handed me a bank check this morning when they came over. 47,000. From Big Tom and the boys and people they called. Some of them I know. Some of them I don't even know. People in towns I've never been to. They all heard about you and the baby and they put in money. Daddy, with what we have from our family, your savings, the equity line, Mom's inheritance, my savings, we're at 84. Add the 47, that's 131,000. More than we need, with buffer. So I'm not selling the bike, Rachel. The motorcycle stays. And you're not going to argue with me. Because I have the check right here in my hand, and I am telling you we have the money. Daddy, she was crying. He could hear her crying. Daniel was saying something in the background. Daniel was asking what was happening, what was wrong. And Rachel was trying to tell him through her tears. "Rachel," Frank said, "there's more. The boys said the donations are still coming in. People are still calling them. Whatever extra money comes in over the next 4 months before the surgery, that's yours and Daniel's. Whatever you need. Travel, hotels, lost income. The boys said they don't want to hear any argument about it, so that's what we're doing." Rachel could not speak. She was crying too hard. Frank held the phone and listened to his daughter cry. And he was not crying himself this time, because something steady had settled into him in the past hour. Something that felt like a foundation underneath everything that was about to happen. The community had moved. The community had decided that this family was its family. That this baby was its baby. That this Marine and his daughter and his unborn granddaughter were going to be carried together through whatever was coming. Frank had been a Marine for 24 years. He understood deeply what it meant to be carried by other people. He had been carried by other Marines in Vietnam more than once on missions that he would never describe to anyone who had not been there. He had carried other Marines too. The act of carrying and being carried was at the center of what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. He had thought when he retired from the Marines that he was leaving that feeling behind, but he had been wrong. The feeling had followed him to Millerstown. The feeling had found him at Millie's Diner. The feeling was alive right now in his garage on this Saturday morning in the form of a check for $47,000 and 6 old men who had decided that no Marine was going to lose his motorcycle on their watch. After a few minutes, Rachel stopped crying enough to speak. "Daddy, you have to tell me their names, all of them. I want to thank every single person. I'll get you a list. Tom is putting one together. I'll get it to you next week. Daddy, this is... I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything to me, sweetheart. You just have to take care of yourself and the baby. That's it. That's the only thing you have to do. The rest of us will handle the money and the logistics and everything else. You take care of yourself. You hear me?" "Yes. I love you, Rachel. I love you too, Daddy. So much. Tell Daniel I said hello. Tell him we'll talk this week about the next steps. I will. Goodbye, sweetheart." "Goodbye." Frank hung up. He set the phone on the workbench. He sat on the motorcycle for a long time in the quiet garage, with the autumn sun coming through the small window, with the check still in his hand. He looked at the bike. He looked at the chrome and the paint and the leather seat. He looked at the workbench with its tools and its empty coffee carrier and its scattered crumbs from the pastries the men had brought. He thought about Margaret. He wished she could see this. He could imagine exactly what her face would look like. She would be smiling, the small private smile she had always smiled when something good happened that she had not been able to make happen herself. The smile of a person who believed in human goodness and who had been proven right one more time. "You would have loved this, Mags," Frank said, out loud, to the empty garage, to his wife who had been gone for 8 years. "You would have loved this morning. You would have made everyone come in for lunch. You would have hugged Big Tom so hard he would have lost his breath. You would have. I can see you doing it." He sat for a while longer. He drank the last of his coffee, which had gone cold. He thought about the motorcycle and about the next ride he was going to take on it, and about the months ahead, and about the granddaughter who was coming, and about the surgery, and about the long road that was ahead of all of them. He thought about a name. He had not told anyone, not even Rachel, but he had been thinking about a name for the baby. Not a name to suggest to Rachel. Rachel and Daniel had their own names they were considering, and Frank did not want to interfere, but a name for himself. A name he was going to hold in his heart for the baby. A small private name that would be his name for her. The way grandparents always have private names for their grandchildren. Names that exist alongside the official names, but that means something specific to the relationship between the older person and the younger one. He had been thinking that he wanted to call her Maggie, after Margaret, after his wife, the grandmother she would never meet but who would be present in some small way, in the name her grandfather called her when no one else was listening, Maggie. He would call her Maggie. The grandmother who could not be there would be there, in the form of a name whispered by an old man holding his granddaughter on his lap on the front porch of a small house in Millerstown. Frank stood up from the motorcycle. He folded the check carefully. He put it in the inside pocket of his leather jacket. He turned off the overhead lights of the garage. He walked to the side door. He stopped. He turned around. He looked at the bike one more time. The motorcycle sat on its kickstand, black and chrome. 31 years of Saturday mornings, 31 years of Sunday rides, 31 years of a man and a machine, and a small green Pennsylvania town, and a wife who had loved him, and a daughter who had pulled him back from the edge after the wife died, and a granddaughter who was coming. The motorcycle was staying. The Saturday mornings were going to continue. The motorcycle had carried Frank through one chapter of his life, and now it was going to carry him through another chapter. The chapter where he was a grandfather. The chapter where he taught a small girl to ride. The chapter where the leather seat would eventually hold a smaller person sitting in front of him, with her hands on the tank and her hair blowing back in the wind, and her grandfather's big arm around her waist, holding her steady. "Thank you," Frank said, to the motorcycle, to the men who had come that morning, to Margaret, to the universe, to whatever was listening on a Saturday morning in Millerstown in October of 2011. He closed the side door. He walked back to the house. The afternoon was busy. Frank made a list. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and made a list of the things he needed to do. First, deposit the check. He drove to the First National Bank of Millerstown and deposited the $47,000 into a separate account he opened that day, specifically for the medical fund. He told the teller, a woman named Sandy who had known him for 15 years, what the money was for. Sandy got tears in her eyes. She told Frank that her cousin's son had been born with a heart condition 20 years ago, that the boy had needed 3 surgeries, that he was now 21 years old and a junior at Penn State studying engineering. She told Frank that hard things were possible to get through and that his granddaughter was going to be okay. Frank thanked her. He left the bank with the deposit slip in his pocket. Second, call Big Tom and the boys. Frank wanted to do something for them. He did not know exactly what, but he wanted to gather them again, somehow, to officially thank them. He called Big Tom from his kitchen. Tom picked up. "Tom, I want to do something for you boys. Some kind of dinner. I'm not sure what." "Frank, listen. We don't need any thanks. We did what needed doing. Just keep showing up at the diner every morning. That's enough." "Tom, Frank, I'm telling you, don't make a big deal of this. We're not the kind of men who like big deals. You know that." Frank knew that. Tom and the boys were not the kind of men who wanted parties or speeches or public recognition. They had done what they had done quietly, and they wanted to keep it quiet. The thanks would happen the way the help had happened. In small moments, in cups of coffee at the diner counter, in the slow accumulation of decades of being present for each other. "All right," Frank said, "but I want you to know I am grateful. All of you. More than I can say. We know, Frank, we know." Third, call Rachel and Daniel. They needed to know what to do next. They needed to talk about the surgery scheduling, about the money, about the practical logistics of the next 4 months. Frank made the call that evening. They talked for an hour. They made plans. They scheduled a visit to CHOP for the following month, when Rachel would meet with the surgical team and they would review the specific surgical plan for the baby. They talked about where Rachel and Daniel would stay in Philadelphia during the hospital weeks. They talked about Frank coming with them, staying nearby, being available for whatever they needed. By the end of the day, Frank had a plan. The plan was solid. The math was solid. The community was solid. The motorcycle was in the garage. The granddaughter was coming. The next 4 months were going to be hard, and the year after that was going to be harder. But they were not going to face it alone. That night, Frank sat in his living room and watched the autumn sun set behind the trees outside his window. He drank a single beer. He had not drunk in years, but tonight he wanted one. He sat in his recliner and let the day settle into him. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Rachel. He thought about the men who had come to his garage that morning. He thought about Maggie, the name he was going to carry in his heart for the granddaughter who was coming. He did not know yet, sitting in his living room on that Saturday evening, that the morning was not over. He didn't know that Big Tom and the boys had not told him everything. He did not know that there was one more piece of the morning that the men had kept to themselves, a piece they had been planning for 48 hours, a piece they had decided would happen the following Saturday. He did not know that the morning that had already changed his life was going to change it again. The week passed quickly. Frank fell back into his routines. Breakfast at Millie's every weekday morning, the Harley sitting in the garage, the small daily rhythms of life in Millerstown. The boys at the diner did not mention the money. They did not mention the bike. They didn't mention the morning in the garage. They talked about the weather and the football game and Henry's tractor and Walter's son arriving from Texas. The conversations were the same conversations they had been having for 10 years. The previous Saturday morning was simply not discussed, the way certain important things are not discussed by men who have done them. Not because they are forgotten, but because they are understood completely by everyone who was there, and saying anything more would only diminish them. Frank took the Harley out on Wednesday afternoon, the first ride since Saturday morning. He did not plan it. He just walked into the garage in the early afternoon, looked at the bike, and decided he needed to ride. The weather was cold, about 45 degrees with a sharp wind out of the north. But the sun was bright and the roads were dry. He put on his leather jacket and his gloves and his helmet. He started the engine. He rolled the bike out of the garage. He rode his usual loop, north through Liverpool, west through Mifflintown, south through the Tuscarora State Forest, back through the rolling farmland to home. 140 miles. About 4 hours. Frank rode the loop with a particular awareness that he had not had on previous rides. The awareness of having almost lost it. The awareness of how close he had come to never riding this loop again. The awareness of what the motorcycle meant to him, and how thoroughly he had been prepared to give it up, and how thoroughly his community had refused to let him. The ride was different than any ride he had taken in years. Every curve felt new. Every familiar landmark felt sharpened. The colors of the autumn leaves, past their peak now, browning at the edges, falling in steady streams when the wind hit the trees, were brighter than they had any right to be. The cold air on his face was sharper, more present, more real. The vibration of the engine through the seat and the handlebars was louder, somehow, as if the bike itself were saying something to him. He stopped at a small overlook in the Tuscarora forest, a pull-off where the road ran along the edge of a high ridge with a view of the valley below. Frank shut off the engine. He got off the bike. He stood at the guardrail and looked out at the valley, the patchwork of farms, the small towns connected by the thin lines of country roads, the distant blue ridge of mountains beyond. He had stood at this overlook hundreds of times over the years. He knew the view by heart, but today he saw it differently. Today he saw the human geography. Today he saw the towns and the farms not as scenery, but as places where people lived, people who had, in some cases that Frank did not even know about, contributed to the $47,000 that was now in his account at the First National Bank of Millerstown. Some of the donors had been from the towns Frank could see from this overlook. Henry had told him that. Walter had mentioned it. People in Liverpool and Newport and Mifflintown and Lewistown. Strangers to Frank. People who had heard from a friend of a friend that an old Marine in Millerstown was selling his motorcycle to pay for his granddaughter's heart surgery, and who had reached into their wallets and given what they could. Frank stood at the overlook and looked at the valley and thought about the strangers who had helped him. He could not see them from here. He would never know most of their names, but they were down there, in the houses, in the small towns, going about their lives. carrying inside themselves the small private knowledge that they had helped a Marine they had never met. Frank stood at the overlook and felt something that was hard to name. Something like the feeling he had felt in Vietnam when he had been carried by other Marines out of a situation he could not have gotten out of alone. The feeling of being part of something. The feeling of belonging to a network of human beings who would, when the moment required it, come for you. He rode home in the late afternoon. The sun was setting as he pulled into his driveway. He parked the Harley in the garage. He patted the leather seat. He went. Inside. He made dinner. He sat at the kitchen table and ate alone, the way he had eaten alone for 8 years since Margaret died. But the aloneness felt different that evening. The aloneness wasn't lonely. The aloneness was the aloneness of a man who had a community around him, a daughter and a son-in-law and a granddaughter coming, a network of people who were pulling for him and his family. He went to bed early. He slept well for the first time in a week. Saturday came again. Frank did not have any particular plans. He had thought about taking another ride. The forecast was good. Sunny, mid-50s, almost warm for late October. He thought he would go to the diner for breakfast first, and then ride one of his shorter loops in the afternoon. He arrived at Millie's at his usual time, 6:45. The diner was already busy. Saturday morning was the busiest time of the week at Millie's, with the regular weekday crowd, plus the Saturday-only crowd of locals who worked during the week and only made it to the diner on weekends. Frank walked in. He waved at Millie behind the counter. He started toward his usual booth at the back. The booth was already full. Big Tom was sitting in Frank's usual seat. Henry, Walter, and Earl were squeezed in next to him. The booth across the aisle was also full. Jimmy, Dale, and 3 other men Frank did not immediately recognize. Big Tom looked up. He saw Frank. "Frank, glad you made it. Come over here." Frank walked over. He looked at the men crowded into the booths. He looked at Big Tom. "Where am I supposed to sit?" Frank asked. "You're not. We're not eating here. We're heading out in a few minutes. We just stopped in to grab some coffee for the road." "For the road? Where are we going?" Big Tom smiled. The other men smiled. The 3 men Frank did not recognize were smiling too. Frank looked at them. 2 of them were older men, maybe in their 60s, wearing leather jackets and motorcycle boots. The third was a younger man, maybe in his 30s, also dressed for riding. "Frank," Big Tom said, "these are some friends of ours, Bobby Lawson and Mike Gerlich. They came up from Lebanon County. The young one is Eddie Saunders, Bobby's nephew. They're members of the Lebanon Valley Patriot Riders." The Patriot Riders. Frank knew the name. The Patriot Riders were a national organization of motorcycle riders, mostly veterans, who attended military funerals and welcomed home veterans returning from deployment. They were a respected group in the riding community. They were the kind of riders who showed up when riders were needed. "Pleased to meet you, Frank," Bobby Lawson said. He extended a big hand. Frank shook it. "I'm a Marine, too. Did 2 tours in Iraq in the early 2000s. Tom and I have known each other for a long time. He told us about your situation. We wanted to come up and meet you." "Thanks for coming up," Frank said. He was confused. He looked at Big Tom. "Tom, what's going on? Get a cup of coffee, Frank. We're heading out in 5 minutes. You're gonna need it." "Heading out where?" Big Tom just smiled. The other men smiled too. Frank looked from face to face, trying to read what was happening. But the men were not telling him. They were enjoying themselves. They were enjoying knowing something Frank did not know. Frank gave up. He went to the counters. He ordered a coffee to go from Millie. Millie looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was holding back a smile. Big day, Frank? Millie said. I have no idea what's going on, Frank said. Millie said. She handed him his coffee. She did not say anything else. Frank walked back to the booth. The men were standing now. They were paying their tabs. They were putting on their jackets. All right, Big Tom said. Let's go. Frank, you're riding with me. Riding where, Tom? To your house. Get in the truck. Frank got in Big Tom's pickup. The other men got into their own vehicles. Walter's truck, Henry's truck, Earl's old Buick, Bobby Lawson's truck with Mike and Eddie. A small caravan of vehicles pulled out of Millie's parking lot and drove the 4 blocks to Frank's house. Frank watched through Tom's windshield. He still had no idea what was happening. They pulled up to Frank's house. They parked along the curb. The men got out. Frank got out. He walked toward his front door. Not the house, Frank, Big Tom said. The garage. We're going to the garage. Frank walked to the garage. He opened the side door. He turned on the lights. The garage was the same as he had left it. The Harley sitting on its kickstand, the workbench, the tools, the small window above the workbench, everything in its place. The men crowded into the garage behind him. Big Tom, Henry, Walter, Earl, Jimmy, Dale, Bobby Lawson, Mike Gerlich, Eddie Saunders. 9 men. The garage was full. Frank, Big Tom said, come over to the bike. Frank walked to the Harley. He stood beside it. He looked at the men. Tom, you're going to have to tell me what's going on. I'm getting tired of guessing. Big Tom looked at the other man. He looked at Bobby Lawson. He looked at Frank. Frank, Big Tom said, last Saturday after we left here, we kept thinking. The check was good. The money was good. But it didn't feel like enough. It was the right thing to do, the money, but it was a quiet thing. You're a Marine. You served your country for 24 years. You raised a daughter who became a nurse. You lost your wife and you got back up and kept going. You taught your daughter to ride a motorcycle. You're the kind of man people should know about. And we thought, Earl thought actually, that the way we sent you off Saturday morning, drinking coffee in your garage, was a private thing. And the private thing was beautiful. But there was another thing that needed to happen. A public thing. A thing that the whole town saw. A thing that you would remember for the rest of your life. Big Tom paused. He looked at Bobby Lawson. So we called Bobby, the Patriot Riders. We told them about you. We asked if they could help us put together something. A ride for you, to honor you, to welcome you officially into the brotherhood of riders who have been carried by other riders. Bobby said yes. The Patriot Riders said yes. They're here today. They came up from Lebanon County. There are more of them coming. They're going to be at the Millerstown VFW in about 30 minutes. Frank stared at Big Tom. He did not understand. More of them. Frank. The Patriot Riders put out the word last Sunday. They told their chapter. They told the chapters in Lancaster and Berks and Schuylkill counties. They told the Pennsylvania State Coordinator. They told Marine Corps League posts in 3 counties. They told VFW posts. They told American Legion posts. The word went out. About you, about your daughter, about your granddaughter, about the bike you almost sold, about the boys at the diner who raised the money. Big Tom's voice was steady. He was looking at Frank with the calm authority of a man delivering important news. There are over 100 motorcycles at the VFW right now, Frank. Riders from all over central Pennsylvania. They came to ride with you today. We're going to ride your loop. The 140-mile loop you ride every Saturday. The whole thing. Together. With you in front. The Marine the community came together to take care of. They want to ride with you, Frank. They want to honor you. They want you to know who you are to people. Frank could not speak. He stood beside his motorcycle in his garage and looked at Big Tom and at the other men and tried to absorb what he had been told. 100 motorcycles at the VFW waiting for him. Tom, get your jacket, Frank. Get your helmet. Roll the bike out. We're heading to the VFW. The riders are waiting. Frank moved on autopilot. He did not have time to process. He put on his leather jacket. He put on his helmet. He picked up his gloves. He pushed the Harley out of the garage and down the driveway. The men followed him. The other vehicles started up. The small caravan of trucks and Earl's Buick formed up behind Frank. Frank started his engine. The Harley roared to life. He clicked into first gear. He let out the clutch. He rode down his street toward Main Street, with Big Tom's pickup behind him, with 8 other vehicles following Tom. The Millerstown VFW was on the south end of Main Street, about a mile from Frank's house. Frank rode toward it slowly. His mind was racing. 100 motorcycles from across central Pennsylvania, there to ride with him. A man they did not know, a retired Marine in a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania. He turned the corner onto Main Street. He could hear them before he could see them. The deep collective rumble of dozens of motorcycle engines, idling, the sound carrying down the street like distant thunder. Frank rode another block. He came around a bend in the road. The VFW came into view. The VFW parking lot, a large gravel lot, big enough for maybe 40 cars on a normal day, was full of motorcycles. Not full, overflowing. The motorcycles were parked in tight rows in the lot, and the rows extended out into the street, and the street itself was lined with motorcycles on both sides for as far as Frank could see down Main Street. Harleys, mostly. Some Triumphs. A few Hondas and Yamahas in the back rows, but mostly Harleys. Big touring bikes with American flags mounted on the back. Smaller cruisers, a few choppers, even a handful of vintage bikes. Older shovelheads, a few panheads, one beautiful 1948 Indian Chief that caught Frank's eye in the front row. The riders were standing beside their motorcycles. Hundreds of riders, men and women, most of them in their 50s and 60s and 70s, many of them wearing leather vests with patches, Marine Corps patches, Army patches, Navy patches, Vietnam veteran patches, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran patches, Patriot Rider patches, Motorcycle Club patches. American flags were everywhere, mounted on bikes, held in hands, worn as bandanas. When Frank came around the bend on his Harley and the riders saw him, the entire crowd began to applaud. The applause wasn't loud at first. A scattered clapping, building, spreading from the front of the crowd to the back. Then it grew. Then it became a roar. Hundreds of hands clapping in the cold October morning, the sound bouncing off the buildings on both sides of Main Street and creating an enclosed wall of sound that surrounded Frank as he rode toward the VFW. Frank slowed down. He rolled the Harley down the street toward the lot. The riders parted to make a path for him. They were applauding. They were calling his name. Some of them were saluting. The older veterans snapping crisp salutes as he rode past, the way Marines salute Marines. Frank rode through the corridor of applauding riders. He could not breathe. He could not think. His chest was tight. His eyes were burning. He kept his eyes on the road ahead because he could not look at the people on either side of him without losing it completely. He rode to the front of the parking lot. There was a small space cleared at the front, beside a large American flag mounted on a pole. Bobby Lawson, who had ridden ahead, was standing there waving Frank in. Frank pulled into the space. He stopped. He shut off the engine. The applause continued. Frank sat on his motorcycle. He took off his helmet. He held it in his lap. He looked at the crowd of riders surrounding him. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of strangers, all of them looking at him, all of them applauding. A woman in her 60s walked forward. She was wearing a Patriot Rider's vest. She was holding a microphone connected to a small portable PA system that someone had set up in the parking lot. She walked up to Frank's motorcycle. She held the microphone up. The applause gradually died down. "My name is Dottie Reinhardt," the woman said. Her voice carried over the PA. "I'm the Pennsylvania State Coordinator for the Patriot Riders. I want to welcome everyone here today, and I want to welcome the man we are here to ride with. Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delano, United States Marine Corps, retired." The crowd applauded again. Frank sat on his bike. He could not move. He could not speak. He nodded at the woman. He nodded at the crowd. "Frank served his country for 24 years, Dottie continued. 2 tours in Vietnam, a career as a Marine, ending with his retirement as a Master Gunnery Sergeant in 1992. Frank, like a lot of us here today, knows what it is to be a Marine. Frank knows what it is to serve. And Frank, 3 weeks ago, made a decision that a lot of us would have made in the same situation. A decision to give up something he loved to take care of his family. Frank decided to sell his motorcycle, the motorcycle he had owned for 31 years, to pay for the heart surgery his unborn granddaughter is going to need. The crowd was silent now, hundreds of riders listening. Frank's friends in this town, Big Tom McKenna, Henry Babcock, Walter Nesbitt, Earl Pritchard, Jimmy Fortenberry, Dale Conrad, these men, the men who have breakfast with Frank every weekday morning at Millie's Diner, decided that Frank was not going to lose his motorcycle. They started making phone calls. Within 3 days, they had raised $47,000 from people in central Pennsylvania who wanted to help. Frank does not have to sell his motorcycle. The money is going toward his granddaughter's surgery. The crowd applauded, loud, sustained. Bobby Lawson and Mike Gerlach were nodding. Big Tom was standing at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed, his face calm but his eyes wet. "But the Patriot Riders," Dottie continued, "and the Marine Corps League, and the VFW, and the American Legion, and the riding community of central Pennsylvania decided that Frank needed something more than money. We decided that Frank needed to know, really know, in his bones in a way he could not forget, that he is part of something larger than himself, that he is part of a community, that when one of us hurts, all of us hurt, that when one of us needs help, all of us help. That is what we are doing here today. We are here to ride with you, Frank. We are here to escort you on your favorite ride. We are here to honor you and your service and your family. And we are here to make sure you never forget this morning." She turned and looked at Frank. "Frank, would you like to say anything?" She held the microphone toward him. Frank looked at the microphone. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the hundreds of faces. He looked at his motorcycle's chrome handlebars. He looked at his hands holding his helmet. He could not speak. He shook his head. He could not. But then something in him moved. Something said, "Speak. Even if you cannot speak well. Even if you cannot find the words, speak. These people came here. They deserve a voice in return. Even a broken voice is better than silence." Frank reached out for the microphone. Dottie handed it to him. Frank held it. He cleared his throat. He looked at the crowd. "Aye," he said. The microphone amplified his voice. The voice was small and rough. He cleared his throat again. "My name is Frank Delano," he said. "I'm a retired Marine. I came to this VFW lot today expecting to have breakfast with my friends. I did not expect this." The crowd laughed gently. Frank smiled. The smile broke something open in him. He could speak now. The words started coming. I served 24 years in the Marine Corps. In those 24 years, I learned something. I learned that you do not get through hard things alone. You get through hard things because other people carry you when you cannot carry yourself. I have been carried by other Marines. I have carried other Marines. I thought, when I retired, that I was leaving that part of my life behind. I was wrong. He looked at Big Tom. He looked at Henry and Walter and Earl and Jimmy and Dale. He looked at Bobby Lawson and Mike Gerlach and Eddie Saunders. He looked at the hundreds of strangers in the parking lot. I have a daughter, Frank said. Her name is Rachel. She is 29 years old. She is 6 months pregnant. The baby, my granddaughter, has a heart condition. She's going to need surgery shortly after she is born. 3 surgeries, actually, over the course of about 3 years. The cost of the surgeries was going to be enormous. So I decided to sell my motorcycle. The motorcycle I have owned for 31 years. The motorcycle that has been part of every important moment of my adult life. I made the decision. I called a buyer. I prepared myself to say goodbye. Frank took a breath. He looked at his motorcycle. He looked back at the crowd. I did not get to say goodbye, because the men I have breakfast with every morning at Millie's Diner refused to let me. They went out and they raised the money themselves. $47,000, raised in 3 days from people in this region, many of whom I have never met, many of whom are here today, standing in front of me, in this parking lot. The crowd was silent, hundreds of faces looking at him. I do not know how to thank you. I do not know what words exist for what you have done. I am a Marine. Marines do not have a lot of words. We have actions. We have presence. We have the willingness to show up for each other when it counts. You have shown up for me. You have shown up for my daughter and for my granddaughter who is not even born yet. And I want you to know, all of you, that I will never forget this. I will never forget what you have done. Every Saturday morning for the rest of my life, when I get on this motorcycle and ride my loop through central Pennsylvania, I'm going to think about you, about all of you, and I am going to think about how much you have given me. Not the money, the bigger thing, the thing the money is a symbol of. Frank's voice broke. He could not continue. He held the microphone in front of him for a moment. Then he handed it back to Dottie. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, whistles. Some of the riders started their engines just briefly in salute, the deep collective rumble of 24 Harley-Davidsons all firing up at once, then settling back into silence. Frank sat on his motorcycle and let the sound wash over him and let himself, finally, after holding it together for the entire morning, cry. He cried hard. In front of hundreds of people, in front of his town, in front of the riders from across central Pennsylvania who had come to ride with him. He sat on the leather seat of his Harley-Davidson FXS lowrider and put his big rough hands over his face and cried the way he had not cried in front of anyone since Margaret's funeral. The riders applauded harder. The applause was warm. The applause was love. The applause was hundreds of strangers telling Frank that it was okay to cry, that a Marine could cry in front of other Marines, that a man could be vulnerable in front of his community without losing anything that mattered. When Frank stopped crying, he wiped his face. He looked at the crowd. He smiled. The crowd applauded one more time. "Now," Dottie said into the microphone, "Frank, you know your loop better than anyone. We are going to follow you. 120 motorcycles. Through Liverpool and Mifflintown and Lewistown. Through the Tuscarora State Forest. Back to Millerstown. We are going to ride with you the whole way. And when we get back here this afternoon, the VFW is hosting a lunch for everyone. Hot dogs and burgers and cold drinks. Everyone is invited. Frank, when you are ready, lead us out." Frank put his helmet back on. He looked at his motorcycle's instrument panel. He looked at Big Tom, who was now standing beside the front row of bikes, holding his own helmet, ready to ride. He looked at Earl Pritchard, who was standing beside a beautiful old Sportster that Frank had never seen before. Earl, who Frank had not known still rode, was apparently riding today. Frank nodded at them. He started his engine. The Harley rumbled to life. Behind him, slowly, in waves, more than 100 other engines started. The sound built into a thunder that filled the entire parking lot and the entire street in the entire small town of Millerstown. The deep collective rumble of motorcycle engines, idling, ready. Frank put the Harley in gear. He let out the clutch. He rolled forward, slowly, out of the parking lot, onto Main Street, heading north out of town. Behind him, more than 100 motorcycles followed, in 2x2 formation, American flags streaming, the sound of their engines a moving wall of thunder that announced to every house and every farm and every passing field that Frank Delano was riding his Saturday morning loop, and that he was not riding alone. He never would again. The ride was the longest 140 miles of Frank's life. Not in time. They covered the loop in about 3.5 hours, the same as Frank's usual solo time, which surprised him given the size of the group. The Patriot riders knew how to move 120 motorcycles efficiently. They had ride captains and tail gunners and middle-of-the-pack coordinators. They communicated by hand signals and brake lights. They moved through small towns at moderate speeds and opened up on the country roads in ways that kept the formation tight without straining anyone's bike. The ride was long because every mile of it was full of meaning, full of memory, full of the strange new awareness that Frank was riding his loop. The loop he had ridden alone 400 times over 31 years, with 120 other motorcycles behind him. They rode out of Millerstown north on Route 17. The townspeople came out to watch them go. People stood on their porches. People stood on the sidewalks of Main Street. Children waved. Old women wiped their eyes. Frank rode past them all in the lead position, with his Harley's chrome catching the morning sun and the sound of 120 engines rolling through town like a slow, patient earthquake. They turned west onto Route 322 at Liverpool. The riders behind Frank were veterans. Frank could feel it without looking. The discipline of the formation, the smoothness of the lane changes, the collective awareness of 24 riders in his immediate vicinity, all of them keeping their distance, all of them watching their lines, all of them trusting Frank to lead them through the curves and trusting each other not to crash into each other from behind. It was the discipline of military riding. It was the discipline of men and women who had served in uniform and who carried that service into their riding the way they carried it into the rest of their lives. They climbed into the Tuscarora forest. The road narrowed. The trees pressed in. The autumn leaves were past their peak now, the second week of November approaching. The colors faded but still beautiful in the way that late autumn is beautiful. Softer, more melancholy, more tender than the bright explosion of mid-October. Frank led the formation through the curves. He kept his speed moderate. He did not need to perform. The other riders were not following him because they wanted to ride fast. They were following him because they wanted to ride with him. Frank thought about Margaret as he rode. He thought about Rachel and Daniel. He thought about the granddaughter in Rachel's belly. He thought about Big Tom and the boys at the diner. He thought about Earl Pritchard, who was riding somewhere in the formation behind him on a Sportster. Frank had not known he owned, who had apparently kept his motorcycle hidden from the diner crowd for years, who had decided to bring it out today because today was a day for riding. Frank stopped at the overlook in the Tuscarora forest, the same overlook where he had stopped on Wednesday afternoon. He raised his hand in the signal for a stop. The formation slowed. Frank pulled into the overlook lot. The motorcycles pulled in behind him. Within 2 minutes, the entire overlook was full of motorcycles. The riders dismounted. They stretched. They drank water from bottles strapped to their bikes. They walked to the guardrail and looked out at the valley below. Frank stood at the guardrail and looked out at the valley too. The same view he had looked at on Wednesday. The patchwork of farms, the small towns, the blue ridge of mountains beyond. But today the view was different. Today he wasn't looking at it alone. Today he had 120 fellow riders standing at the guardrail with him, all of them looking at the same view, all of them participating in the same moment. A man Frank did not know stepped up beside him. The man was in his 70s. He was wearing a Marine Corps League leather vest with patches that included a Vietnam veteran patch and a USS Hughes City patch. The man took off his helmet. He looked at the valley. "Frank," the man said, "my name is Calvin Mercer. I served in Vietnam in 1969 and 1970. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. My Harley is right over there." He pointed to a black Road King in the front row. "Pleased to meet you, Calvin." "Frank, I have to tell you something." "All right." Calvin looked at the valley. He looked at his hands, resting on the guardrail. He looked at Frank. "In 1973, Calvin said, my wife and I had a baby boy, our first child. He was born with a hole in his heart. They didn't know what to call it back then. They hadn't named all the conditions yet. But it was the same kind of thing your granddaughter's going to have. He needed surgery, open heart surgery, in 1973 on a 6-month-old baby. The technology was nowhere near what it is now. The chances were not good." He paused. "He made it. He's 51 years old now. He has 3 kids of his own. He's a high school principal in Hershey. I'm telling you this, Frank, because I want you to know that the same kind of surgery your granddaughter is going to have was performed on my son 51 years ago. And he is still alive. The technology is so much better now. The surgeons are so much better now. The recovery is so much better now. Your granddaughter is going to be okay. I am telling you this because I want you to carry it with you. I want you to ride with this knowledge in your chest. The babies survive. The babies grow up. The babies become high school principals." Calvin's hand was on the guardrail. Frank's hand was on the guardrail. Calvin moved his hand the few inches that separated them and put it on top of Frank's. 2 old Marines, standing at an overlook in the Tuscarora forest on a Saturday morning in November of 2011, with their hands together on a rusted guardrail. "Thank you, Calvin," Frank said. "Carry it with you, Frank." "I will." Calvin walked away. He went back to his motorcycle. He put on his helmet. He sat on his bike and waited for the ride to continue. Other riders came up to Frank during the stop. 2 dozen, maybe more. Each of them had something to say. Some of them were Marines, some were Army, some were Navy, some were Air Force, some were not veterans at all. Just civilian riders who had heard about Frank and wanted to ride with him. Each of them had a story. A daughter who had been sick, a son who had served in a war and come home damaged, a wife who had died of cancer, a brother who had made it through something that had seemed impossible. Each of them in their own way was telling Frank, "I have been where you are. I know what you are feeling. I survived it. You will too. The babies survive. The communities show up. The hard things become memories instead of present tense. Frank listened to all of them. He thanked all of them. He shook all of their hands. After about 40 minutes, the formation remounted. Frank led them back onto the road. They rode south through the rest of the forest. They came out of the trees onto the rolling farmland. They rode through the small towns. They came back into Millerstown around 2 in the afternoon. The VFW lot was set up for the lunch. Long folding tables had been set up under canopies. Grills were going. Hot dogs and burgers and chicken were cooking. The smell of grilling meat carried through the cold November air. People from town were there. Wives and husbands of the riders, members of the VFW auxiliary. Townspeople who had heard about the ride and wanted to be part of the celebration. Millie from the diner was there, having closed Millie's for the afternoon to attend. The mayor of Millerstown was there. The pastor from the Methodist church was there. The riders parked their bikes. They came in for lunch. Frank stayed on his bike for a moment after he parked. He looked at his Harley. He patted the leather seat. He patted the fuel tank. He said quietly, the way he had been saying things to the bike all month, "Thank you for staying with me." He walked into the lunch. The lunch lasted 3 hours. Frank moved through the crowd. He met people. He shook hands. He listened to stories. People wanted to give him money. They had checks in their pockets. They had cash. They had been carrying donations all morning, planning to give them to him at the lunch. By the end of the afternoon, Frank had collected another $9,000 in donations. He gave all of it to Rachel that evening. He drove to Hershey after the lunch. He stayed for dinner. He told Rachel and Daniel about the ride. He showed them pictures that one of the Patriot riders had taken. A photograph of Frank in front of the formation as they pulled out of the VFW lot, 120 motorcycles stretching down Main Street behind him. Rachel cried looking at the photograph. Daniel cried too. They kept the photograph. They put it on their refrigerator. The next 4 months passed. The community continued to give. The total reached by the time the baby was born. In February, just over $72,000 from the Diner Boys fundraising effort, plus the lunch donations, plus the smaller checks that kept arriving in the mail at Frank's house through November and December and January. With the family's contribution of $84,000, the total was $156,000. More than enough. Significantly more. Enough to cover the surgeries and the recovery and the unexpected expenses, and to leave Rachel and Daniel with a small medical fund to draw on for the next several years. Frank kept the motorcycle. He rode it through November and into December, before the cold made riding impractical. He rode it in the spring of 2012 with new appreciation for every mile. The baby was born on February 18th, 2012, a Saturday. Frank was in the waiting room at Hershey Medical Center with Daniel's parents. Rachel had been induced because the doctors wanted the delivery to happen at a hospital connected to a major pediatric cardiac unit, with the surgical team prepared and on standby. The delivery was complicated but went well. The baby was born at 3:47 in the afternoon, weighing 6 pounds and 4 ounces. The surgical team was waiting. They took the baby almost immediately. They began the first surgery within 12 hours of birth. The surgery was successful. So was the second one 6 months later. So was the third one 3 years after that. Rachel and Daniel named the baby Margaret Ann Delano Hart. Margaret after Frank's wife, Ann after Daniel's mother. Delano Hart with a hyphen, joining both families. But Frank holding her for the first time 3 weeks after she was born, when the first surgery was over and the baby was finally home from the hospital and stable enough for visitors, called her something else. holding the small, fragile body of his granddaughter against his chest, looking down at her tiny face, feeling the impossible miracle of a child who had made it through open-heart surgery at 3 days old. Frank whispered the name he had been carrying in his heart for 4 months. "Hi, Maggie," he said, quietly, so that only the baby could hear. And Maggie, the name Frank used, became the name everyone used. The official name on her birth certificate stayed Margaret Ann, but everyone in the family from the very beginning called her Maggie. Rachel's idea eventually, Daniel's agreement, Frank's quiet satisfaction. Maggie grew up healthy. The third surgery when she was 3 was the last one she would need. By the time she was 5 years old, she was running and playing like any other child. By the time she was 8, she was begging her grandfather to take her on motorcycle rides. By the time she was 10, Frank was teaching her to ride, a small dirt bike at first in the field behind his house, with Frank running alongside her, holding the back of her seat the way her grandfather had once held the back of her mother's seat 25 years earlier. Frank took her for her first real ride on the Harley when she was 12. She sat in front of him on the leather seat with his big arms around her, holding the handlebars, with her hands on the tank and her hair blowing back in the wind. They rode the Saturday morning loop, the same loop Frank had been riding for 42 years by then. The same loop he had ridden with 120 other riders in November of 2011, on the day his community had come together to make sure he did not lose his motorcycle. Maggie loved the ride. She loved the loop. She loved the motorcycle. She loved her grandfather. When she was 16 in 2028, Frank gave her the Harley. He had been planning it since she was born. The bike was rightfully hers. It always had been. Frank rode his last solo ride on the Harley in the spring of 2028. A long ride. The full loop, plus an extra 50 miles. He rode it slowly. He stopped at the overlook in the Tuscarora forest. He stood at the guardrail where Calvin Mercer had stood beside him in 2011 and put his hand on his. Frank was 78 years old now. His knees were not good. His back was worse. He could no longer ride the way he used to ride. The handoff to Maggie was the right thing. The motorcycle would have a new rider, a young rider, a rider who would carry it through the next 30 or 40 years the way Frank had carried it through the previous 48. He gave her the bike on her 16th birthday, May 4th, 2028, a Saturday. Frank had asked the diner boys to come over. Only 3 of them were still alive by then. Big Tom McKenna had died in 2019 of a heart attack at the age of 71. Walter Nesbitt had died in 2022. Dale Conrad had died in 2024. The remaining 3, Henry Babcock, Jimmy Fortenberry, and Earl Pritchard, were in their 80s now. They came over. They sat on Frank's porch. Maggie stood in the driveway beside the Harley. Rachel and Daniel were there. Rachel was 46 now. Daniel was 48. They had had 2 more children after Maggie, a son named Liam, 11, and another daughter named Claire, 8. Frank handed Maggie the keys. "This is yours now," he said. "I want you to have it. I want you to ride it. I want you to take care of it. And someday, when you have your own children, I want you to give it to one of them. The motorcycle has been in our family for almost 50 years. I want it to keep going." Maggie took the keys. She was crying. So was Rachel. So was Daniel. So were Henry and Jimmy and Earl on the porch. "Grandpa," Maggie said, "I'll take care of her, I promise." "I know you will." Maggie hugged Frank. Frank held her for a long time. He smelled the shampoo in her hair. He felt the strength in her young body. He thought about how impossibly small she'd been 17 years ago, in his arms in the hospital. with a healing scar running down her chest from open heart surgery. He thought about the surgeons who had saved her life. He thought about the diner boys who had saved his motorcycle. He thought about Margaret, who had not lived to see her granddaughter born, but who had been present in the form of a name in every moment of Maggie's life. He let Maggie go. He stepped back. He looked at the motorcycle. "All right, Maggie, take her for a ride." Maggie put on a helmet, the same helmet Frank had been wearing for the past 20 years. It fit her. She'd inherited her grandfather's head shape somehow. She got on the Harley. She started the engine. The deep, familiar rumble of the V-twin filled the driveway and the yard, and the small May afternoon. Maggie put it in gear. She rolled out of the driveway onto the street. She rode away, slowly, carefully, the way Frank had taught her to ride. Frank stood on his porch with Henry and Jimmy and Earl. Rachel and Daniel stood beside him. Liam and Claire were in the yard. The sound of the Harley faded down the street. Maggie was gone, around the corner, riding her own loop now, the loop that her grandfather had ridden 400 times alone, and once with 120 other motorcycles behind him. The motorcycle was hers now, the next generation, the continuation. Frank looked at his old friends on the porch. Henry was 81 now. Jimmy was 86. Earl was 88, and he had stopped wearing his coveralls only because his daughter had told him he had to. The three of them looked back at Frank. They were all that was left of the original 7. The rest were gone. "Boys," Frank said. "Frank," they said. He sat down with them on the porch. They drank coffee that Rachel had brought out. They sat in the May sunshine and listened to the distant sound of the Harley as Maggie rode it back toward the house. "It's been a hell of a thing, hasn't it?" Frank said. "It has," Henry said. "All of it," Jimmy said. Earl, the old mechanic who had spoken maybe 2,000 words in his entire life, looked at Frank. "You almost sold that bike," Earl said. 17 years ago." "I did, but you didn't. Because of you boys." Earl nodded. He looked at his coffee. "That's what we do, Frank. That's what we did. That's all we did." The sound of the Harley grew louder. Maggie was coming back. She came around the corner. She rode down the street. She turned into the driveway. She rolled to a stop. She shut off the engine. She put down the kickstand. She took off the helmet. She was grinning. She was crying and grinning at the same time. "Grandpa," she said, "it's the best motorcycle in the world." "I know it is, Maggie." She walked over to the porch. She sat down on the steps in front of her grandfather. She leaned her head against his knee. He put his hand on her hair. The 4 old men sat on the porch in the May afternoon and listened to the small sounds of the spring, the birds, the wind in the trees, the distant cars on the highway, the breathing of the young woman on the steps. The Harley sat in the driveway with its engine cooling. The history of the motorcycle was now part of Maggie's story. Frank's story was nearly finished. Maggie's story was just beginning, and the motorcycle was the connection between the two, the metal link that joined one generation to the next, the chain that passed from grandfather to granddaughter on a Saturday afternoon in May, in a small Pennsylvania town, in a country full of small Pennsylvania towns, in a world that mostly ignored these moments, but where these moments, again and again, were the thing that actually mattered. Frank Delano died in 2032 at the age of 82, a peaceful death in his sleep, in the same bedroom where he had slept alone for 29 years after Margaret died. Rachel found him in the morning. He was on his side, facing the window, his eyes closed, his face calm. On the nightstand beside him was a photograph, a picture of Maggie, age 20, sitting on the Harley grinning, taken by Rachel on a Sunday afternoon 2 months earlier. Frank had asked Rachel to print the photograph. He had asked her to put it in a frame. He'd been keeping it on his nightstand. He had been looking at it every night before he went to sleep. His funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Millerstown. The church was full. About 200 people attended. Among them were 40 motorcycle riders who arrived in formation and who escorted Frank's casket from the church to the cemetery on the north side of town. The riders included 3 Patriot riders who had been at the original ride in 2011. Most of the others were younger. Many of them had heard the story of Frank's ride over the years and had wanted to be part of his final ride. Maggie led the procession on the Harley, the 1979 FXS lowrider, black and chrome. The same motorcycle Frank had bought new in 1980 and had owned for 52 years and had given to her on her 16th birthday. Maggie was 24 now. She was a doctor, a pediatric cardiologist, specializing in the same condition that had nearly taken her life as an infant. She had become a doctor because she wanted to do for other children what the doctors at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia had done for her. She rode at the front of the procession. She led her grandfather's casket through the streets of Millerstown for the last time. The townspeople came out to watch them go. They stood on porches. They stood on sidewalks. The same townspeople, older now, grayer now, who had watched Frank ride out with 120 motorcycles in November of 2011, watched his granddaughter ride out with 40 motorcycles in October of 2032. The motorcycle is still in the family. Maggie still rides it. She rides her grandfather's loop every Saturday morning when the weather permits. North through Liverpool, west through Mifflintown, south through the Tuscarora State Forest, back through the rolling farmland to home. She has a son now, a small boy named Frank. He is 3 years old. He sits on the leather seat of the Harley sometimes on Saturday mornings, while his mother polishes the chrome and explains to him what each part of the motorcycle does. He listens with the particular attention of a small boy who has been told that the motorcycle is going to be his someday, when he is old enough, when his mother decides to pass it down. The chain continues. The motorcycle continues. The Saturday mornings continue. And every once in a while, on a particular morning when the autumn sun is hitting the chrome just right, and the small boy is sitting on the leather seat, and Maggie is standing beside him with a polishing cloth in her hand, she leans down close to him and whispers something her grandfather used to say to the bike when she was little and watching from the corner of the garage. "Thank you for staying with us, old friend." The boy does not understand what she means. Not yet. But someday he will. The motorcycle will tell him, the way the motorcycle has always told the people who love it the most. And the chain will continue. And the Saturday mornings will continue. And the family of riders that started with Frank Delano in 1980 will continue into a future that none of them can see. On the back of a black and chrome Harley-Davidson that has been carrying a family through grief and joy, and the long, beautiful loops of an American life, for as long as any of them can remember. That is the story of Frank Delano, the Marine who almost sold his motorcycle to pay for his granddaughter's hospital bill, the Marine whose friends at the diner refused to let him, the Marine whose town came together for him, the Marine who lived to see his granddaughter become a doctor and ride his motorcycle through the same Pennsylvania hills he had ridden through for half a century. Some stories are about loss. This one is about something else. This one is about what happens when a community decides, all at once, that one of its own is not going to face the hard thing alone. This one is about what happens when good people refuse to look away